Welcome everyone to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here, and I'm pretty excited to be talking about Apple's newest portable machines. In this video, we are of course going to be talking about Apple's brand new 13-inch MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, 13-inch MacBook Pro, both rocking Apple's brand new custom silicon, the M1 processor, replacing the Intel chips that were previously inside of these machines. So right now, as I said, the new machines are not out yet, so these are just last generation machines, but we are going to talk about all the specs that differentiate these two models, why you may be inclined to choose the MacBook Pro over the new MacBook Air, or the new MacBook Air over the MacBook Pro, and at a high level, how performance is going to differ. Once these things are out, we will have full in-depth analysis on performance and heating between the two machines, but for now, we're going to focus on kind of a high level and how these two machines are going to stand apart. So let's dive into it. The new MacBook Pro and the new MacBook Air, both running Apple's M1 silicon. So from a high level, starting off with design, neither of the designs have really changed from last generation. They pretty much look just like the models that we have here in front of us. The only real changes from last generation is the new MacBook Air has an updated function row keys, but otherwise these guys pretty much look physically the same. They both have a 13.3-inch display with 227 ppi. They both support the P3 wide color gamut and True Tone. So one small difference between the two is the MacBook Pro is actually slightly brighter. It has a maximum peak brightness of 500 nits, whereas the MacBook Air is limited to only 400, possibly just due to the larger battery that is contained inside of the MacBook Pro. Other than that, these guys are very similar in shape and size. Of course, you have the wedge design on that MacBook Air versus more of a slab design on the MacBook Pro, which is more uniform shape going across. The MacBook Air weighs in at 2.8 pounds, whereas the MacBook Pro, 13-inch MacBook Pro, comes in at 3 pounds. So very little weight difference between the two, even though the MacBook Air appears much thinner when you're actually holding it in your hands. Because of that tapered design, it feels a whole lot smaller. It's a little bit easier to travel with, even though the weight is only very little difference between these two machines, only about 1/4 of a pound. So other than that, these guys have pretty much not changed from last generation, and they look and feel very similar to one another, just a little bit more portability on the side of the MacBook Air. Internally, these guys both can be configured up to 2 terabytes of SSD storage and can be configured up to 16 gigs of RAM. No matter which ones you pick up, they're going to start off with 8 gigs of unified memory inside of there, and the MacBook Air will start off with 256 gigs of SSD storage. The second tier will start at 512. The MacBook Pro, on the other hand, it starts off at 512, and you can configure it up to 2 terabytes too. So if you're picking up kind of that second tier MacBook Air, it's already in line storage-wise with the new MacBook Pros. Both of these guys are rocking M1 processors on inside, and they are the same processor, though there's a small difference that we need to point out. So on the MacBook Air, it starts off with a 7-core GPU. So both have 8-core processors, but a 7-core GPU on the entry-level $999 MacBook Air. The second tier MacBook Air, you're getting that 512 gigabytes of storage, and you're getting an 8-core GPU. MacBook Pro starts off with the 512 gigs of storage and that 8-core GPU. So the second tier MacBook Air and second tier, or just the MacBook Pro in general, starts off with 512 gigs of storage and an 8-core GPU. So that GPU is really the only difference in the processor between these two machines. Both M1 processors, both 8 cores of CPU, and then a 7-core and an 8-core, and just that 8-core option on the GPU side. So if you're looking for better graphical power, you're gonna need that second tier MacBook Air starting at $1,249, or the MacBook Pro starting at $1,299. To back that up, one of the biggest differences between the two machines is the fan, or lack thereof. The MacBook Pro has a fan on the inside. Inside is an actual fan that helps cool the machine down. It'll spin up, it'll make some noise, but there's a fan inside. You need to know that. On the MacBook Air, there is no fan. Just like the 12-inch Retina MacBook that Apple has discontinued, completely silent design on the MacBook Air, regardless if you're getting the entry level or the second tier up with that 8-core GPU. Both of them completely fanless, completely silent machines. If you're looking for a quieter machine, MacBook Air is where you need to look. But that fan design has a couple consequences. So the MacBook Air is gonna have incredible performance. We can promise you that even without actual benchmarks yet, it's gonna perform incredibly well. But it's going to have lower sustained speeds of those high performance cores. As a processor gets hotter, it's going to have to throttle itself down so it doesn't overheat. So we don't know where that's going to come into play, but we can tell you that while the efficiency cores are good, as it gets hot, it's going to need to pull back a little bit. So even though they have the same processors inside, the fact that the 13-inch MacBook Pro does in fact have a fan, it's going to give you higher sustained clock speeds on that processor. Just how physics work, it's going to cool that processor down, it's going to allow it to stay faster for longer. So if you're doing anything that requires intensive CPU tasks, rendering videos, editing and compiling code, working with large graphics files that you need to save and export and manipulate, 3D objects, anything like that, anything that's graphic intensive or CPU intensive is going to work better on the 13-inch MacBook Pro just because it has a fan. It's not a huge leap to say that, but a lot of people don't kind of put those two together, that without the fan, you're gonna get slightly impacted performance. High efficiency is gonna be great, daily tasks are not gonna be pretty much any different between the two, but anything that is intensive, we're going to see a better performance on the MacBook Pros. We'll know how much better of a performance once we actually get our hands on them, but that's what we can tell you right now just from Apple specs and the information available. These guys both work over USB-C for charging. They both have the same ports on the side. They each have a headphone jack and two USB/Thunderbolt ports there. The MacBook Air, it charges using a 30-watt USB-C power brick that's included in the box. The MacBook Pro, it charges over a 61-watt USB-C power brick, again included in the box. So by going with a larger one, you get a slightly better power brick if you're using it for anything else that you need a lot of power on. Maybe you've got a really large battery pack like the Zendor Super Tank or Super Tank 2 or Super Tank Pro, and you really want that high speed to charge it up. Maybe beneficial in that regard just to go with the higher end machine. When you're looking at the GPU option, there's not a huge price difference, just another reason to go towards the Pro there. The other difference is going to be battery life. Slightly heavier machine, slightly bigger machine, 2 hours additional battery life in each task that Apple measures. So as far as web surfing, you're gonna get 15 hours on the MacBook Air, and you're gonna get 17 hours on the MacBook Pro, and you're going to get 18 hours of TV streaming on the Apple TV app versus 20 hours on the new MacBook Pro. 20 hours is the largest battery life Apple has ever given to one of its MacBooks or MacBook Pros. So incredible battery life for this Mac, up to 20 hours of TV streaming. That's absurd. So battery life is going to be slightly better here on the MacBook Pro. Take that into consideration. The other small change here is in terms of microphones. So they each have a 3 microphone array with dual beamforming technology, but Apple says the ones on the MacBook Pro are studio quality microphones versus apparently not studio quality. So just better quality microphones, and I would also argue probably better speakers. We've always had better speakers on the Pros, though we don't know that until we get our hands on them, but better microphones for sure here on the Pro. So that pretty much sums it up between the difference between these two machines. If you're looking at all between these two machines, you're looking at upgrading that storage on here, you're possibly caring about that additional GPU core, you're within $50 of the MacBook Pro. So $50 difference between the second tier MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. And by going to the MacBook Pro, you get a brighter display, you get better battery life, you get the touch bar, overall you get a better machine. I think for the $50, better performance too, gotta mention that, better performance. So for $50, just between those two, you're getting a ton of things for that $50. So I think the MacBook Pro is highly worth it if you were looking at the upper tier MacBook Air. But if you want the silent machine, you're not looking for those those really high-end, high-performance cores and the extra GPU core. You just need an amazing machine that's gonna be super fast. That's where this guy is gonna come into play. Choose the MacBook Air. Both these guys are great. Better performance over here, but amazing value over here. You can't go wrong with either of them. Let me know down below in the comments over on Twitter which one you prefer. If you're gonna be picking up a MacBook Air or a MacBook Pro, find me at Andrew_OSU. And if you wanna grab either of these two machines, we've already started compiling the best deals and discounts, and we put them down below in the description, so go ahead and snap one of those up.